Do some people deserve to die? Should there be a death penalty? Contrary to what some proponents of capital punishment believe, these are not two ways of asking the same question. While I support the ACLU and Amnesty International's efforts in seeking the abolition of the death penalty, as well as the prevention of executions in the meantime, I wouldn't dispute that some people deserve to die. What's the alternative view? No one has ever done anything such that they don't deserve to live? There are no crimes that are so reprehensible that the death penalty seems proportionate and warranted? Proponents of capital punishment often burn their energy zealously defending claims that I would not dispute. They'll recount grisly stories highlighting some of the darkest chapters of human existence, then throw up their hands as if it's just plain obvious that this person deserves to die. But this is not where the conflict lies. First, in no way does it follow from some people deserve the death penalty that this organization should be permitted to determine guilt and carry out executions. There's a chasm between the judgment that some people plausibly do not deserve to live and the judgment that a given body should have the legitimacy to determine guilt and kill people based on its assessments. Imagine if I gave an impassioned defense of the death penalty and concluded by saying that the power to perform executions should be in the hands of the Lincoln Elementary School PTA. The Parent-Teacher Association from an elementary school in Southwest Michigan should be the arbiters of guilt and death. After all, capital punishment is justified, necessary even. Likewise, it does not follow from some people do not deserve to live that the state should end the lives of some of its citizens. Ask yourself how much you trust the police, the court system, and the state generally. Are they the body who should be given this power over life and death? Who should be permitted to kill us with impunity? It's not enough to defend the idea that we have free will, that we're responsible for our actions, that some people have committed unspeakable acts of evil, or even that the worst of the worst deserve to die. If you defend the death penalty, you must defend the death penalty in practice, not just in theory. Why? Because people will be killed in practice, not just in theory. To defend capital punishment is to defend the police, the courts, and the state generally in its ability to determine guilt and carry out punishments. Abstract moral arguments are insufficient. You need to defend the state explicitly if you want your case for capital punishment to withstand an iota of scrutiny. Even though some people plausibly deserve to die, that doesn't mean that any particular organization should have the legitimacy and power to carry out executions. These practical concerns don't cut straight to the heart of the matter, but it is a fact that no man-made guilt-determining structure will be without flaws. It will determine guilt imperfectly, and imperfectly is a hell of a euphemism here. So how comfortable are you with killing innocent people, like George Stinney? Once again, it is an unavoidable fact that a defense of the death penalty in practice means defending the murder of innocents at the hands of the state. The murder of 14-year-old George Stinney could have been avoided. Unfortunately, he will not be the last innocent victim of the death penalty. To quote the ACLU, the death penalty system in the U.S. is applied in an unfair and unjust manner against people, largely dependent on how much money they have, the skill of their attorneys, race of the victim, and where the crime took place. End quote. In other words, the application of capital punishment is often morally arbitrary. It's not as if the death penalty is exclusively reserved for the worst of the worst. Even setting aside the innocents who have been on death row, those who are guilty are often undeserving as well. Even many advocates of capital punishment will acknowledge that the death penalty system is often applied in a morally arbitrary manner. Joshua Markey, for instance, believes that many of those on death row do not deserve the death penalty. To be clear, he thinks that many of these people are guilty, they just don't deserve to die for what they did. Even when guilt is determined correctly, there's no guarantee that the death penalty will be an appropriate punishment, since capital punishment in practice is applied in a morally arbitrary manner. What people like Markey don't ever seem to realize is that this is inevitable. And if they do understand this, then it follows that they're consciously defending a pro tanto morally arbitrary system of ending human lives. Even if we eliminate the current sources of arbitrariness in our justice system, New ones will surely replace them. Any cursory glance at the history of capital punishment should assure us of this. Whether it's the laws themselves, the application and enforcement of the laws, or the determination of guilt, there will be unjustified killings. Since I'd rather not kill innocent people, this is a major concern for me. It's plausible that human error is the ultimate source of moral arbitrariness in the death penalty system. But human beings are involved at every single stage of the process, so it's reasonable to conclude that we will never eliminate moral arbitrariness from the death penalty system. Some might worry this argument proves too much. If we're so concerned with the imperfect determination of guilt, and by extension the administration of punishment, then shouldn't we abolish prisons? After all, some innocents are imprisoned, some laws are morally arbitrary, and even just laws are arbitrarily enforced. In his treatise against the death penalty, Benjamin Yost defends the principle of remedy. This is, according to Yost, a fundamental tenet of liberal political morality. We know the state will make mistakes, and an institution sensitive to justice must be prepared to remedy its mistakes. Execution, however, is irreversible. It can't be remedied, and consequently falls short of this ideal. There's a finality to death that renders it disanalogous to imprisonment. If a prisoner is discovered to be innocent, as thousands have been in the wake of forensic advancements, not to mention moral progress in eliminating unjust or nonsensical laws, they can be freed and paid damages. Those who have been wrongly killed, however, cannot be resurrected. Quote, "If a liberal state must abstain from unjust coercion, it must also endeavor to alleviate all those illicit burdens it does impose. To fail to try to put things right evinces a callousness to injustice that, if not equivalent to countenancing the original wrongful act, stands in close proximity." End quote. It's not about having the punishment undone, which is impossible. The wrongfully imprisoned can't get those years of their life back. The asymmetry between imprisonment and the death penalty lies in our inability to bring the punishment to an end and to try to make things right for the wrongfully convicted. While those who have been imprisoned can be freed and paid damages, those who have been killed cannot have their punishment brought to an end or remedied. And though you might think the families of the wrongfully killed could receive damages, that's not the same as compensating the one who was wrongfully convicted. There's no chance of remedy for them, because the death penalty enthusiasts had them killed. What if we're certain? What if we reserved capital punishment for those whose guilt was certain? The problem with this is that it ignores the current standard, which is already supposedly high enough to preclude any reasonable doubt. I mean, what do they think the standard is now? 70% confidence? Despite this nominally high bar of beyond a reasonable doubt, many innocents have been wrongfully convicted and put to death. In most, if not all of those cases, there was room for reasonable doubt, but this high-minded standard was imperfectly applied, which is exactly what would happen, has happened, with any standard of certainty or near certainty of guilt. Besides, any specific example is going to be contentious. In the past, many judges, juries, members of the press and public have felt that the evidence was only possible to interpret in one way, only to discover that they had been mistaken. This requirement of certainty, in addition to ignoring the fact that this is effectively the standard already, does nothing to undermine the other ways in which the accused could be unworthy of capital punishment. We could be confident that the defendant was guilty of stealing a spoon. Of course, they wouldn't deserve to be hanged for this offense, though that's exactly what happened to Andrew Brenning in 1801. As Joshua Marquis, an advocate of the death penalty, admits, many of those presently on death row do not deserve the death penalty. The correct determination of guilt is still no guarantee that the offense will warrant capital punishment. It was the case in 1801, and it's still the case today. We can make progress. We no longer kill 13-year-olds like Brenning for stealing spoons. Yet, I doubt anyone would defend the idea that we have a perfect justice system, or that we'll ever have a perfect justice system. Outside of thought experiment land, it'll always be imperfect. Even if we stipulate to the people handing out these irreversible punishments, oh, by the way, you have to be certain. Once again, how is this requirement of assurance any different from beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the standard now, and was the standard at the time of every death penalty horror story in recent memory? The evidential standard for receiving the death penalty was never, oh, flip a coin, check your crystal ball. Every innocent who's been convicted and put to death died at the hands of people who thought they couldn't be wrong. The abolition of the death penalty, say its apologists, would involve a genuine moral cost. Those who deserve execution will walk free. But granting that this is a genuine evasion of justice doesn't mean it's the only consideration we need to factor in. So John Wayne Gacy is killed by lethal injection instead of just dying in prison. Great. But is that worth George Stinney? Because that's the cost. The moral side of my case rests on the idea that saving innocent lives is far more important than ending those of the guilty. Killing those who deserve to die is just not as important as saving those who don't deserve to die. Even the defenders of capital punishment could be swayed by altering the ratio of guilty to innocent executions. Many of them will make it known that they're willing to have an innocent person killed here and there at the hands of the state, if it means killing 99 others who deserve it in their eyes. Maybe they're comfortable with 1 in 1,000, or 1 in 100, but 1 in 10? 30%? 40%? When does saving the innocent countervail the punishment of the guilty? What if we had to kill 99 innocent people in order to kill one person who deserved it? I think any morally normal person would agree that that would be unacceptable. So, how many innocent people are you, the defender of the death penalty, comfortable with killing? How much blood on your hands is too much? Oh, you say you value innocent life, up there on your high horse, yet you've forgotten about the real victims. It's not the people who are sitting on death row. Many of those people are guilty, and they did commit heinous crimes. What about their victims? Do they matter at all? Or are you only concerned with the people on death row? So one version of this objection, from death penalty apologists, is a moral claim about just deserts. We're doing right by the victims in our execution of the criminal. And as I've been trying to say, I don't really dispute this. I do, however, think that taking an innocent life is a major countervailing consideration. In fact, it's often the offense that landed the criminal in this position to begin with. If we were really horrified by the perversity of killing an innocent person, extinguishing the life of one who truly does not deserve it, then shouldn't we be horrified at the prospect of doing it ourselves? The second version of this objection is an empirical claim about the deterrent effects of capital punishment. To quote the ACLU again, the death penalty is a waste of taxpayer funds and has no public safety benefit. The vast majority of law enforcement professionals surveyed agree that capital punishment does not deter violent crime. A survey of police chiefs nationwide found that they ranked the death penalty lowest among ways to reduce violent crime. They ranked increasing the number of police officers, reducing drug abuse, and creating a better economy with more jobs, higher than the death penalty as the best ways to reduce violence. The FBI found that the states with the death penalty have the highest murder rates. End quote. The protection of innocent people is at the center of my anti-death penalty position. One reason it seems so obvious to me that protecting innocent lives is far more important than doling out capital punishment is the contrast between these two moral statements. A. If even one innocent person is killed, opposing the death penalty is justified. B. If even one guilty person is killed, supporting the death penalty is justified. While the first statement is at least defensible, the latter is a joke. There's an obvious asymmetry here, because saving innocent people is more important than killing guilty people. The staunchest defender of capital punishment wouldn't appeal to a few worthy recipients if they were the exception. If we have to kill 99 innocent people just to kill that one guilty person, then the whole thing is worth it. Unless the vast majority are guilty, even they would lose their stomach for supporting the policy in practice. We already agree that preserving innocent life is far more important than justifiably killing the few who deserve it. Yet they have a much higher tolerance for killing innocent people than I do. This next section will not resonate with everybody. I'm going to assume that revenge is not immoral across the board, and some on both sides will take issue with that assumption. But for those who don't think revenge is always impermissible or ill-advised, you might be able to appreciate an additional reason the death penalty strikes some of us as so odious. Even when everything goes as it's designed, when a person guilty of a heinous crime is sentenced to death, the virtues of revenge are absent. Advocates of capital punishment seem to have something quite lofty in their minds, but their self-image is delusionally inaccurate. The clinical and cowardly way in which life is being taken drains any remaining respect I might have had for our death penalty system. Opponents of the death penalty disparagingly use the phrase legalized revenge, which is a concept that does strike me as repellent, but not for the same reason as most who use the term. For me, it's the legalized part, not the revenge part. Our legal system is intended to be impartial and impersonal. When offenders commit crimes, the conflict is between the offender and the state. But revenge is personal by nature. And make no mistake, the death penalty is about revenge. It's certainly not about restorative justice or the prevention of crime. And yet it's carried out in a bloodless, processual, legalized manner. Emotionless killing is unsettlingly creepy, and there's certainly nothing cathartic or satisfying, let alone virtuous, about this kind of legalized revenge at the hands of a dispassionate third party. It no longer resembles anything like honorable revenge. So what's the point? Earlier we talked about why merely justifying the idea that some people deserve to die is insufficient to justify the death penalty system. Likewise, defending the permissibility of revenge when terrible wrongs have been committed is insufficient to justify the death penalty system. In his book, Why Honor Matters, Tamler Sommers writes that while vengeance is, quote, hard to contain, hard to get right, it's certainly not inherently immoral. Interestingly, the emotions behind the desire for revenge are absent only in those who we'd likely regard with suspicion and disgust. In Book 34 of Genesis, a young woman named Dinah is kidnapped by a powerful man and raped. While her two brothers are grieved and angry, their father, Jacob, seems to be neither, and is primarily concerned with avoiding conflict and how he might profit from being paid damages by his daughter's rapist. At great personal risk, the two brothers disobey their father and kill their sister's tormentor, and also a lot of other people. It's the Old Testament. I'll spare some of the details. It's a great story, you should actually read it. As Sommers explains, quote, the brothers' virtue lies not just in the act of revenge, which is gruesome and arguably disproportionate, but also in the anger that causes it. By adopting a prudent what's done is done and let's make the best of it approach, Jacob shows nothing but a concern for his safety and profit. The two brothers, by contrast, are too outraged over the treatment of their sister to engage in a cost-benefit analysis. Their anger leads to a decidedly imprudent act of revenge, and it's the imprudence that demonstrates loyalty to their sister. End quote. Of course, no one in their right mind would offer unconditional support for any and all tales of vengeance. Quote, honorable avengers demonstrate virtues like bravery, loyalty, and integrity. They take risks and accept responsibility for their actions. End quote. Most of us are naturally drawn into some stories of revenge, fictional or not, and repelled by others. What explains this distinction in many cases is not a blanket condemnation or affirmation of revenge. I think it has more to do with those conditions that Sommers identifies. For example, in the summer of 2014, 3 Israeli settlers drove through East Jerusalem looking to avenge the deaths of 3 other Israelis in the West Bank. The settlers were looking for someone, quote, lightweight, who could easily be targeted. They came across a young Palestinian named Muhammad, 16 years old, and threw him in their car before speeding off to a more remote area. The 3 settlers beat the teenager to death and then set him on fire. They attempted to destroy all the evidence, but they were quickly caught and convicted of murder. As Summers explains, quote, honorable avengers demonstrate virtues like bravery, loyalty, and integrity. They take risks and accept responsibility for their actions. The 3 Israeli settlers showed none of these characteristics. They were cowards, looking for a physically slight victim to make the abduction easier and less risky. The killers did not accept responsibility. They tried to burn all the evidence of their behavior. One of them pleaded insanity at the trial. End quote. Summers, in the light of his more general defense of our moral intuitions concerning honor and dishonor, offers a novel argument against the death penalty at the end of the 5th chapter of his book. He begins with an illustration from the 1988 presidential debates, in which Michael Dukakis, leading the polls at the time, is widely believed to have fumbled an answer so spectacularly that it cost him the election. Moderator Bernard Shaw asked, "If your wife, Kitty, were raped and murdered, would you favor an irrevocable death penalty for the killer?" Dukakis replied, quote, "No, I don't, Bernard, and I think you know that I've opposed the death penalty during all my life. I don't see any evidence that it's a deterrent, and I think there are better and more effective ways to deal with violent crime. We've done so in my own state, and it's one of the reasons why we have the biggest drop in violent crime of any industrial state in America, and why we have the lowest murder rate of any industrial state in America." End quote. After the election, the conventional wisdom held that any presidential candidate opposed to the death penalty was unelectable. But as Summers argues, quote, opposition to the death penalty wasn't the real problem with his answer. Rather, it was the clinical nature of his answer to such a personal question. Like Jacob, Dukakis showed no depth of feeling, no anger, no fierce loyalty to a close family member. His wife has been raped and killed, and Dukakis is worried about whether the death penalty is a deterrent. This is no time for a cost-benefit analysis. End quote. Summers invites us to imagine if this had been Dukakis' response instead. As you know, I've been against the death penalty all my life. I don't think it's the state's business to end the lives of its citizens, no matter how heinous their actions. If Kitty had been raped and murdered, I wouldn't want the man to be executed by lethal injection 15 years later, after dozens of appeals and legal challenges. I'd want to track down that son of a bitch before the law could get a hold of him, and kill him myself. I'd think it was my job to do it, not some district attorney, or judge or jury of 12 people who didn't even know her. Maybe society can't allow that to happen, but that's what I'd want to do in that situation. As Summers explains, quote, this response would have allowed Dukakis to retain his opposition to the death penalty and turn the tables on those who accused him of being soft on crime. Now it's the proponents of capital punishment who are clinical, cowardly, and by the book. They're the ones who want a torturous legal bureaucracy to do what a decent husband should want to do himself. By tapping into virtuous qualities of revenge, Dukakis could have had the best of both worlds. End quote. He unpacks this argument against the death penalty a bit more and connects it to his broader views in moral philosophy. Quote, critics of the death penalty often refer to it as legalized revenge, but the truth is closer to the opposite. Honor cultures think it's shameful when third parties punish people who have wronged them or their families. Revenge is personal. Most arguments against the death penalty involve deterrence and racial bias, and thus far those arguments haven't resonated with a majority of the US population. Is the death penalty a deterrent? Probably not, but proponents can reply that it's not about deterrence, it's about justice. Is there a racial bias in how the death penalty is applied? Absolutely, but advocates can reply that we must work to eliminate the racial bias, not prohibit the practice. But what if, like my hypothetical Dukakis, opponents called the death penalty dishonorable, a sign of cowardice and weakness? This challenge might have greater resonance, especially for people in the so-called honor states, where capital punishment is most popular. End quote. If you're at all interested in moral philosophy and moral psychology, then I really can't recommend Why Honor Matters enough. And if that doesn't convince you, then buy it just to help assuage my guilt over including a gigantic block quote. Summers believes that we're capable of reorienting our understanding of justice to reflect what's true and good about revenge without incurring its unacceptable costs, but that this would require a more fundamental reevaluation of our Enlightenment values and our rejection of honor culture. Honor can ward off cowardice, shamelessness, and selfishness. Properly contained, it can engender courage, integrity, self-respect, loyalty, solidarity, and potentially cure some measure of alienation and atomization. But back to the subject at hand. Even granting that someone might deserve to die, that doesn't mean that every way of going about it is just as good as any other way. Some stories of revenge killings, fictional and non-fictional, possess virtues such that many, if not most people, can't help but feel at least a tinge of admiration. An issue I have with some proponents of the death penalty is their unearned pride and towering self-regard. Death by lethal injection years after the crime at the hands of a faceless employee is a far cry from the invigorating stories of revenge. Where's the bravery, or courage, or risk-taking, or strength, or loyalty? None of that is present. The reality of the death penalty isn't that it's excessively cruel, but that it's a cowardly, sanitized, impersonal, embarrassing husk of what its proponents undeservedly claim to embody. Of course, those who at least profess to think there's nothing good about revenge won't be moved by this one way or the other. For those of us who see something good about revenge, some forms of it, you have to ask yourself if its virtues are present in our death penalty system. It seems to me they are pretty obviously not. I have to at least take one moment to turn towards a certain kind of death penalty apologist. Obviously not all of them, just some of them, remind me a lot of a police officer from Uvalde. In May 2022, a mass shooting occurred at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. 18-year-old Salvador Ramos killed 19 students and 2 teachers and wounded 17 others. There have been several scandals involving the police department, and we won't get into them now, but it seems clear that the police were too afraid to do much of anything as the children were being massacred. One image from a security camera made quite an impression on me. There's a police officer, gun drawn, standing aside, doing nothing, checking his phone, and his phone's wallpaper is of the Punisher. Children are being gunned down, screaming. Why he checked his phone, I don't know, but the Punisher wallpaper ensured that this would forever be branded on my brain. For those who are unaware, The Punisher is a TV show about a vigilante. This is the show description. Quote, after exacting revenge on the people responsible for the deaths of his wife and children, Frank Castle uncovers a conspiracy that runs deeper than New York's criminal underworld. Now known as the Punisher, he must dig deep into the conspiracy to discover the truth about injustices that affect more than just him and his family. End quote. Hey, here's your chance. Here's your chance to be the unstoppable badass you imagine yourself to be. So many advocates of capital punishment are this man, with a gulf between their self-image and what they actually are. I think we all know guys like this who have body armor and guns, and they're just playing dress up. It's just a costume party for grown-ups. And some of these people are police officers, and some of these people advocate for the death penalty because they're so fucking badass. No, they're not bleeding hearts. They're not soft. That's why they advocate the death penalty. And that's why they want someone else to do the thing that they don't have the courage, loyalty, and strength to do themselves. The fact is that some people don't possess these qualities and seem to think that advocating capital punishment proves that they don't lack them. But the sickly reality of the death penalty is pretty far removed from what these people seem to have in mind. You're not the fucking Punisher for advocating the death penalty. You're asking someone else to do the thing that you would never have the courage, loyalty, or strength to do yourself. So instead, you pretend to have those qualities, completely unearned, while a faceless employee of the state carries out a sanitized, impersonal version of quote-unquote revenge that's been stripped of every virtue. If one were to bet on my position on the death penalty based on some of my other views, they'd probably guess wrong. I believe in free will. I think human beings are responsible for their actions, and I'm not opposed to retribution in all cases. I think there are virtuous qualities to revenge, and I think some people deserve to die. Further, the more common arguments against the death penalty, to me, have little to no import. To quote Jeffrey Howard, "The standard argument for abolishing the death penalty holds that even when moral agents have culpably perpetrated heinous wrongs, executing them is an unacceptable attack on their dignity, something that even they do not deserve to suffer." End quote. Their dignity? If this was the only reason to oppose the death penalty, I would unequivocally support it. We would certainly not be doing wrong by a sadistic murderer in killing them. All this to say that I'm the ideal audience for advocates of the death penalty. Their typical arguments don't sway me because none of that is sufficient to legitimize state-sanctioned capital punishment or overcome the considerations I've raised. Maybe some of those considerations have been slightly unorthodox, but even some of the more common arguments against capital punishment can withstand the predictable barrage of death penalty apologetics. Amnesty International helpfully compiled and condensed 5 reasons to abolish the death penalty. Some of the points made are in accordance with what I've been saying, and some of them are new. 1. It is irreversible, and mistakes happen. Execution is the ultimate, irrevocable punishment. The risk of executing an innocent person can never be eliminated. Since 1973, for example, more than 184 prisoners sent to death row in the USA have later been exonerated or released from death row on grounds of innocence. Others have been executed despite serious doubts about their guilt. 2. It does not deter crime. Countries who execute commonly cite the death penalty as a way to deter people from committing crime. This claim has been repeatedly discredited, and there is no evidence that the death penalty is any more effective in reducing crime than life imprisonment. 3. It is often used within skewed justice systems. In many cases recorded by Amnesty International, people were executed after being convicted in grossly unfair trials, on the basis of torture-tainted evidence, and with inadequate legal representation. In some countries, death sentences are imposed as the mandatory punishment for certain offenses, meaning that judges are not able to consider the circumstances of the crime or of the defendant before sentencing. 4. It is discriminatory. The weight of the death penalty is disproportionately carried by those with less advantaged socioeconomic backgrounds or belonging to a racial, ethnic, or religious minority. This includes having limited access to legal representation, for example, or being at greater disadvantage in their experience of the criminal justice system. 5. It is used as a political tool. The authorities in some countries, for example Iran and Sudan, use the death penalty to punish political opponents. The opponents of capital punishment just seem to be more clear-eyed about the imperfect, arbitrary, and discriminatory nature of the state's process of determining guilt. So, a few parting considerations. 1. Arguing that some people deserve to die is not sufficient to show that any particular organization should have the power and legitimacy to carry out executions. 2. Capital punishment is not reconcilable with the principle of remedy. When mistakes are inevitably made, the punishment for the wrongly convicted cannot be brought to an end, and they cannot be given damages. 3. Since the application of the death penalty will inescapably be morally arbitrary in some cases, either due to the morally arbitrary nature of the laws themselves, the enforcement of the law, or the imperfect determination of guilt, we cannot have the death penalty without murdering innocents. Since saving innocent life is more important than ending the lives of the guilty, this should dissuade us from instantiating a death penalty system. And finally, the virtuous qualities of revenge are absent in the death penalty system. Imagine someone you love on trial for something they did not do. They're wrongfully convicted in a slow, clinical legal process, and after a lengthy time in prison, they're killed by lethal injection. I can scarcely imagine the horror of finding oneself in this position of knowing that someone you love will soon be taken from you by a mob acting with the pretense of civility and honor. It's something I wish on no one, and I hope that those responsible for putting innocent people to death will someday come to their senses and stop perpetuating this madness. Thank you for listening. I've been Emerson Green, and I'll talk to you next time.
you.